All right, looks like we have another packed house. This is fantastic. I've actually been to a lot of these conferences, and I've never seen one with such enthusiasm and such attendance. So this is fantastic. I hope you guys are having a good time so far, and I hope you're learning a lot about Google technologies. I noticed some faces from my earlier sessions. This is great. We'll just carry on where we left off. For those of you who didn't attend the first session, if you're interested, we'll end up posting these online. But the way I've got it laid out, I think will give you a good idea of what's going on, even if you didn't attend the first session. So my name is Chris Ramsdale. I work in developer relations with the Google Web Toolkit team. And today, I'm going to start talking about how to build business apps with the Spring technologies that we integrated with. So we started off in the keynote talking a little bit about this today, and I gave about a 5-minute overview. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper in today, and then we're going to kind of expand out on what it means to actually build business applications. So a brief agenda. You know, I had this worked around, and I kept moving the agenda around until I got comfortable with it, and I had demos towards the end to kind of wrap things up. And I thought to myself, you know, it's weird when we talk about business applications and enterprise applications, it varies greatly. Sometimes there's internal engineers that are writing internally facing applications where your HR department or your expenses department, finance department will be using them. Then there's independent software vendors, so ISVs, that are creating the next killer app that could be a business or enterprise app. It doesn't always have to be inward facing. So I thought what we'd do is we'd start with demos. And then we'll move on, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the tools, the integrated set of tools that we're providing with VMware and Spring. We'll talk about the framework that we're providing. So you saw today when Spring actually generated some code. Well, it was generating code that was based on the GWT 2.1 release. So we might as well talk a little bit about that and understand what's going on under the hood. And then finally at the end, we'll bring it all together with a couple of slides to show you how to get your application up and running using this new framework that we've built out with Google Web Toolkit 2.1. So without further ado, we'll jump into some demos. So when I think of a business app from a Google standpoint, there's one that comes to mind all the time, and that's AdWords. It is the front end that drives our business. While we have a lot of things that we do in Google, one thing we do the most is sell ads online, right? And this is an application that allows you to come in and generate a campaign. Say you're a pizza store, you can do pizza ads online, and you generate who you're going to target, when you're going to target, and some other demographics about your user base. And this was all built with Google Web Toolkit. They did a rewrite about a year and a half ago now, and they went from doing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript by hand to saying, you know, this is a big enough application, and it means enough to the company, that we need to rewrite it using a real language. Nothing against JavaScript, but when you have a huge app, I mean, this is hundreds of thousands of files and millions of lines of code, it becomes much easier to maintain when it's written in a language such as Java, and you have tools to go along with it. So stepping out of the Google realm for a second, another one that comes to mind is IBM Blueprint. Now, this was previously a company called Lombardi, and they're based in the States. And what they were doing was they were trying to model business processes on the web. And this is a great example of what usually would have been a desktop application. And it was built with Google Web Toolkit 2.0, and they've recently updated to 2.1 as well because they've been following along as we've been doing development. So I thought I'd bump out and give you kind of an idea of what's going on with this application. So here I have a new project started. And I've said, okay, in this project, I actually have milestones. So I have a milestone 1 and a milestone 2. And what I can do is I can move these around and say, okay, I want to switch things up because this activity right here is tied to milestone 1. So I have a list of activities I have to accomplish to get past milestone 1. And again, I can switch those up. I can come in and I can add a milestone. I can edit it just like that. It's really hard to demo with this thing right here. I can add an activity. Again, clicking on it. Do this. There you go. And I can add the participants. I can add the business owners, the experts. It's not necessarily what is actually what I'm adding to the app. It's the look and feel. It's what I'm doing. So it's for my business. I'm a manager, and I'm trying to schedule a whole bunch of employees to get a project to completion. That's what I'm trying to do. There's no reason I have to have a crummy application that takes forever to load and is only installed on my desktop. I should have this available to me via the web, and it should feel like a normal desktop application. And I think here, too, the in situ effect, the fact that everything's happening within the one window and I'm not jumping around to forms, I can keep my contextual awareness. I'm more efficient that way. And that's really the power of Google Web Toolkit. Regardless of 2.0 or 2.1 or what we're releasing, from the get-go, it's been build an app on the web and just host it in the browser. And that's it. The difference between a desktop application and a web application is that we're hosting this one in the browser. Now, there are some side effects that you can deploy it to the cloud, which is really nice. But step one is getting it off the desktop. And I think they've done a fantastic job here of creating an application that feels like a desktop application. In fact, so much so that they actually ended up getting acquired by IBM. So hats off to them. So for our next example, I actually wanted to bring up a local product manager from a company called Web. Ottavio Slava is going to talk about their application that they built using Google Web Toolkit. Ottavio?
Boa tarde, eu sou Otávio, eu sou gerente de produto da Web. Vou falar um pouquinho primeiro para vocês o que a Web faz. A Web é uma empresa que o objetivo dela é identificar e capturar oportunidades de redução de custo e aumento de eficiência para compras e logística. Então, nosso objetivo principal é fazer nossos clientes gastarem menos no que eles compram, ou no processo deles de compra, ou no processo logístico. A gente busca isso e alcança, na verdade, combinando ferramentas tecnológicas e muito conhecimento de processo. E dentro da nossa solução de procurement, principalmente compras, né, compras online, a gente tem essa ferramenta que é o Web Business Suite, que ela estrutura principalmente a troca de informações entre empresas e fornecedores, e isso é disponibilizado principalmente no formato software como serviço. Então a gente essencialmente desenvolve aplicações para o mundo enterprise, para grandes e médias empresas do Brasil e na América Latina também. Então nosso objetivo é desenvolver aplicações web, mas ao mesmo tempo elas podem ficar muito complicadas para você simplesmente desenvolver isso em HTML e JavaScript. Então a gente entendeu que a gente precisava de uma interface bastante rica, ao mesmo tempo preservando a lógica de negócio necessária para fazer toda essa redução de custo e os cálculos para os nossos clientes. Inicialmente, a gente tinha um servidor, um software servidor Java, servindo páginas JSP para os nossos clientes, nesse front-end, com uma lógica bem definida. É um software que a gente comprou uma parte dele, depois veio customizando e desenvolvendo para o mercado brasileiro durante alguns anos. E chegou algum momento que a gente tinha que sair dessa parte de JSP. Isso já estava integrado com diferentes ERPs de clientes. Então, o que a gente entendeu? Fizemos uma pesquisa extensa e decidimos pela utilização do GWT como ferramenta para desenvolver esse tipo de software. Então, a gente não quis perder nada da lógica de negócio que a gente tinha. A gente colocou um servidor GWT na frente para fazer como uma fachada para a lógica de negócio que a gente tinha e que provê, de fato, informações para um client GWT que, assim como a aplicação do Blueprint que o Chris mostrou, é uma aplicação com toda a cara de desktop rodando num browser. Então é isso que eu vou gastar alguns minutos aqui para mostrar para vocês que tipo de aplicação que a gente está falando. O que eu vou mostrar para vocês aqui é um dos nossos módulos de aplicação, que é onde uma área de compras compara preços. Então, do mesmo jeito que a gente, quando está precisando comprar alguma coisa, geralmente passa em duas lojas, as empresas também precisam de diferentes cotações para comparar. Então, aqui a gente está com um exemplo, é a aplicação rodando no browser. Eu vou mostrar para vocês, a gente está comparando aqui cotações de impressoras e toners. Tá? Isso foram respostas que diferentes fornecedores enviaram e a gente está analisando. Então, estou comprando uma impressora HP, toner, uma LaserJet, um toner, uma multifuncional e cartucho para essa multifuncional HP. Aqui eu começo a ver, só um segundo, as diferentes propostas de fornecedores que eu tenho. Tá? Então, tem uma informação que eu estou vendo aqui, que é esse número de respostas, que está, para mim, é irrelevante, que todo mundo respondeu só uma vez. Então, simplesmente eu tenho um configurador de campos que eu estou enxergando. Número de respostas, eu posso ir tirando ele. Isso é tudo uma aplicação, tudo isso que vocês estão vendo é uma aplicação rodando no browser, com HTML e JavaScript, com todas essas informações, desenvolvida 100% de AWT. A aplicação inteira, só a parte cliente, são mais ou menos 100 mil linhas de código Java. Então vocês podem imaginar aqui que isso pode virar quando você constrói, se a gente estivesse construindo isso em JavaScript puro. Outras coisas que a gente tem aqui que são interessantes é o seguinte: esse comprador, ele já tinha um preço de referência que era baseado nas últimas compras, era o target dele para essa compra. Então, por exemplo, a impressora HP Laser, ela era R$450 a referência, o toner 235. Então, essa ferramenta já está calculando para ele quanto que ele está tendo de economia ou de penalty, ou seja, quanto que ele está piorando o gasto dele. Então, vamos definir, ele pode definir que a meta dele para estar tudo ok é ele conseguir 3% de saving. Clicando aqui, ele já me mostra para todos os fornecedores como é que está o meu saving e me dando alertas vermelho, verde e amarelo. Então eu já vejo já de cara que essa empresa aqui, a Arcan Corporation, ela está muito ruim. Os preços dela, estou tendo penalty em todos eles, então eu vou tirar ela da tela. Então desmarco, ela já fica em cinza e depois eu posso filtrar. Então ela simplesmente sai da tela. Tudo isso com Java, desenvolvido em Java e compilado para JavaScript. Vocês podem ver que é uma coisa muito rápida rodando no browser. E eu consigo também, eu consigo ver os prazos que cada um desses fornecedores me deram. A Blue Corp, que ainda está aqui na minha decisão, ela me ofereceu pagamento à vista, sendo que a Acme me ofereceu 90 dias. Então eu posso calcular, trazer isso daqui é uma coisa muito comum nas empresas, que elas comparam quanto elas pagam de taxa de juros para pegar capital de giro versus o que o mercado está oferecendo, o que esse fornecedor está te oferecendo. Então você pode colocar uma taxa de juros, vamos supor que eles pegam eles têm uma taxa muito boa com os bancos para fazer capital de giro, então vamos colocar 2% aqui, eu recalculo, acontece. Foi porque minha sessão expirou. Deixa eu logar de novo aqui. Então, quando eu recalculo, ele traz para mim o cálculo novamente, trazido a valor presente. Outra coisa que eu posso fazer aqui são critérios qualitativos de julgamento, onde eu posso ter. Aqui eu já preenchi a partir de notas, já foi preenchido a partir de notas que eu trouxe do sistema, mas eu consigo dar uma nota geral, onde para atendimento, que vale 25% do meu score, proposta comercial, que são de fato os preços e a qualidade da proposta comercial, e também para o suporte. Então eu dou uma nota, o sistema calcula. Então se eu for, por exemplo, alterar isso daqui para 5, cai aqui a nota. Se eu, por exemplo, desse uma nota muito ruim para Blue Corp, ele já me indica que o score da Acme é melhor. Outra coisa que eu tenho na ferramenta que eu posso utilizar são o conceito muito parecido com o conceito de labels que a gente tem no Gmail, que vocês devem utilizar. Eu posso marcar aqui o que são material de supplies, né? Não é hardware. Então eu crio um lote de... Então ele vai marcando com uma label. Agora eu vou marcar o que é HP. e depois eu posso filtrar por esse slot. Isso, aqui para essa demonstração, eu fiz uma de 4 itens apenas, mas quando você muitas vezes está comprando centenas de itens. Então isso ajuda bastante, por exemplo, se você quer só ver para tomar sua decisão em cima do lote que são os meus labels de supplies. Então eu filtro e agora aqui eu só tenho as aplicações. Então, existe uma série de outros features que a gente colocou. Eu quis mostrar só essa parte para vocês como um exemplo bastante claro de aplicações, como elas podem ficar complexas quando você vai para o mercado enterprise, business to business, em grandes empresas, e que faz com que o GWT seja uma ferramenta excelente para esse tipo de desenvolvimento. Por quê? Porque a gente não está... Eu estou desenvolvendo isso numa linguagem fortemente tipada, eu estou desenvolvendo em Java, eu consigo alavancar o conhecimento da equipe que desenvolvia código servidor e estava desenvolvendo Java já para o servidor, ou JSP, ele, com o mesmo conhecimento de Java, ele desenvolve isso daqui e é compilado, e várias outras vantagens também no ciclo de desenvolvimento. As ferramentas que você usa, você pode continuar usando o mesmo conjunto de ferramentas, desenvolver com Eclipse, utilizar servidores de integração contínua, da mesma forma, e usar ferramentas, todos os plugins que você quer usar no Eclipse, desde análise estática, usando Find Bugs, PMD, o que quer que seja, você consegue programar regras para que a programação seja também correta quando você desenvolve com GWT. Então, acho que era basicamente isso que eu queria mostrar para vocês. Então, só para deixar claro, toda a lógica de negócio fica nessa parte da Business Logic, e a gente tem em cima disso um servidor de AWT que faz de fato o depara, né? A transformação necessária para falar entre o nosso software antigo com essa interface toda na frente nova. Então é isso, queria só agradecer a vocês, e aqui tem meu contato, caso alguém queira ter maiores, tirar dúvidas depois, eu estou disponível por e-mail. Também vou estar aqui até o fim da apresentação, se vocês quiserem entender um pouco mais sobre como a gente desenvolveu isso. A gente tem uma equipe de 30 desenvolvedores, 30 programadores que estão desenvolvendo essa ferramenta no nosso escritório no Rio. Então vou voltar para o Chris, para ele continuar entrando em mais detalhes sobre o GWT para aplicações enterprise.
Thanks, Otavio. So there was one thing about his story that resonated with me quite well when I originally met him, well, geez, about a year ago, actually, which is that it was an existing application, existing infrastructure that they were able to move over to use Google Web Toolkit. So if you're sitting here today and you work for a company and you're steeped in legacy technology, don't think that there's not a chance that you could move into making killer web apps. Right? You saw it right there. He has a typical back-end system that, like many of us have had at some point in time when we've worked for various companies. And what they started doing was they started carving out portions where they could use GWT. And by segmenting it, and by probably having very good design patterns as well, they were able to say, okay, this portion still goes to the existing back-end, and this portion goes to the new back-end and resulting new front-end, which was built with GWT. And it's an important note as I'm going to work through the next portion of the deck. So we briefly touched on this morning some of the integration work that we've been doing with VMware and Spring tools. And today, while Eric Tolome was talking about cloud portability, I'm going to bring that up one more time. I want to really focus on developer tools. I mean, that is our core competency back in the Google office where I come from. It's all about developer tools. So the motivation was, in fact, cloud portable business apps. But there was another side part, too, which is that I want to see hyper-optimized business apps running in the browser. That's really my goal, and I share that goal with several people back at Google, more than several. So what we did was we took a look at the anatomy of a typical business app, right? Now, this is a broad brushstroke. I don't expect that this is actually applicable to everything, but we said, you know what, there's a range of developers, first of all. There's ISVs and enterprise developers. They typically contain a lot of boilerplate code. They end up being primed for code generation. I think we can do something about that. And there's forms over data usually for the simplistic ones, and they're not optimized for the browser, not all of them at least. So how can we fix this? And this was going back to Eric's point that when we looked at the lay of the land, when we looked at who was out there, we saw Spring, we said, you know what, they have a set of tools that perfectly mimics what we have. And I'm going to show you that. But first I'm going to talk about developer lifecycle. So we said, okay, given that this is the anatomy of the app, given that this is what you're going to build, or what you have right now, what does it look like when you build it? Right? So we talked about we talked about basically generating code, bootstrapping your application, getting up and running. Like, how long does that take? Does it take 1 day? Does it take 3 days? Does it take an entire week? Like, you know, when you start a new project and then all of a sudden your dev manager comes along or the PM comes along, pesky PMs, come along and they say, you know, getting to show, it's demo day, what do you have? What do you have, right? How long does it take to bootstrap your application to get going? But once you have that, you want to iterate. You want to write some code. And this is actually where the fun begins, because then you've got a great environment. You might have a small team you're working with, and you're just in a really fast cycle. Then you get close to the end. You want to start debugging, so you want to fix some code. You're going to optimize some code, right? You're at that last 20, 10, 5% of your application. Ooh, and then you ship, right? So go celebrate, get some sleep. So this is the typical development life cycle. For building the app that I just showed, how do we create a set of developer tools that make this seamless? So we looked at the tools you may know. Spring Developer Tools, I've covered most of these. Spring Roo generates code. SpringSource Tool Suite is your IDE. Spring Insight is it's a performance enhancing, that's funny, performance metric gathering tool that allows you to identify sluggishness in your application. Talk about that more in a second. Then we noticed that VMware, the parent company of Spring, had a cloud technology called vFabric that allows you to deploy to on-premise environments. And then essentially they had tools to build business apps fast. Okay, so they had the business portion and fast down. Then we looked at what we had. We said we have Google Developer Tools. We have Google Web Toolkit, our Java to JavaScript compiler and code generation. Google plugin for Eclipse, which gets you back into the IDE. Speed Tracer to measure sluggishness in the browser. And then we have, obviously, cloud technology, App Engine for Business, as well as the consumer-facing App Engine. And the net was that we have tools for building killer web apps. So if you bring the two together, then we've accomplished what I first set out, which was the anatomy of the business app and the lifecycle the developer lifecycle. So when you break it down, you've got Spring Roo and GWT. You want to optimize for developers, minimize boilerplate, and ultimately get that nice Ajax feel, so it looks like feels like you're running a desktop application in your browser. When you want to iterate, and you've moved on in the cycle, use SpringSource Tool Suite and Google plugin for Eclipse to easily install. It's baked into STS, so if you actually download SpringSource Tool Suite when you leave, you'll have a dashboard where you can immediately get our tools to get started. So there's not a bunch of moving around to find some SDK and some plugin, it's just there. Once you have it, you can build your app fast, code generation, refactoring, quick fixes, and you can iterate quickly. As I showed off this morning in the keynote, and as well as in the first session, in-browser debugging, no compiler phase, no deployment phase. One of the topics that I haven't touched on was how you optimize your application. And that's using Speed Tracer along with backends such as App Engine and Spring Insight. And what Speed Tracer does, it has, like I said in my first session, it has hooks into WebKit, which is what Safari and Chrome are built on top of, to actually measure things like paint, layouts, garbage collection, so that when your app starts running slow, you can easily tell, just speed trace it. And then what we have done is we've integrated that with back-end solutions, right, such as Speed Tracer and App Stats for App Engine, that will give you the server-side metrics, bring them together in one unified UI to see, okay, this is why it's slow in the browser, this is why it's slow in the server. I have a holistic view, I have a round-trip view of why it's slow. So then finally, when you're done bootstrapping, iterating, debugging, optimizing, you want to deploy. And this was the goal from kind of a high level when we went to integrate the two products, was that you should be able to choose one of these to deploy to. VMware vCloud, Google App Engine, VMware vSphere, any other cloud. And we actually made that happen. So I want to show one more demo before we move on. So how many of you are familiar with Spring we've been talking about. How many have you actually used Spring Developer Tools? All right. So there's a conference called Spring One that happened last week in Chicago. And we went out there and had a great time. It was my first time ever at that conference meeting some other developers. But one of the things we did was, it was the first time they were announcing hosted SQL support coming out of App Engine for Business. This is one of the things that Eric had talked about in his keynote. It's very close to being production grade. Right now we're in the trusted tester phase. That means we've got a beta quality version of it that we're getting people involved in. And one of the people we got involved in it was a Spring engineer. And we said, you know what would be really, really cool? If you could take one of your Spring apps that's never run an App Engine before, has all the Spring backend, has all the SQL integration, and you could just drop it on App Engine. That would be proof that we've actually accomplished our goal. And sure enough, with literally like maybe changing, I asked him 25 lines of code out of like 20,000 lines of code, had it running in a weekend. So this is their travel app, just a basic app that comes with Spring Webflow, has nothing to do with Spring Roo, has nothing to do with Google Web Toolkit, has everything to do with running on App Engine, as you can see by the URL. It's tough for you to see in the back, but it's running off of appspot.com. This is the hotel application. It's a travel application. And so I can go in and I can search for hotels, so maybe in Chicago. And there you go. I've actually queried a SQL backend, hosted in our cloud, and I brought back a result, and I can click on that. Here we go, view hotel, sorry about that. Brings up that, I can say book it. Okay, I'm gonna pick my date. And I want non-smoking, ocean view. And I don't have a fake credit card number right now, but you can see it's querying the system right now and pulling back the results. All he had to do, this was the nice part, all he had to do to get this to happen, besides tweaking a few lines of code, was replace the JDBC driver that he was using in a connection string. That was it. So when we talk about these things being cloud portable, we're really serious about it, and this is proof positive that this is actually going on. So the framework, the new Google 2.1 release. So when Spring Roo goes off and generates a whole bunch of code, as you saw this morning, it's got to generate that code for something, right? And it's got to generate it for some framework. And what we've done is Spring and a lot of the enterprise community are built on top of the MVC pattern, so the model view controller pattern. It's great, it's fantastic, it scales well, but it doesn't quite work perfectly for web apps. Basically what you got to do is you got to tweak it a bit and separate your view and controller code just a tad bit more for testability reasons and for performance reasons. But for all intents and purposes, if I say MVP, just think MVC and you'll be okay. So what we knew is that Spring Roo was already generating this MVC type application. Industry best practices, we said this is perfect. We use these best practices internally, we just haven't codified them. We haven't pulled them into a framework themselves, right? What we would do is you have people like me and other engineers on the GWT team going around saying like, you know, if you want to build big applications, you should go do da-da-da-da-da-da. And we'd rattle off like 3 different things you need to do. So we should take those best practices and pull them into a framework. And that's exactly what we did. And we did quite a few other things too. So let's go over those. So when we talk about Google Web Toolkit, it's really comprised of 3 main products. Google plugin for Eclipse, Speed Tracer, and the Google Web Toolkit SDK. Some minor enhancements to the top 2. So from the Google plugin for Eclipse, we now have browser profiles. So this morning you saw me right-click on that URL and I could pick Firefox or Safari. And very soon we'll have support for Chrome and Mac as well. It's pretty nice. Nice little enhancement. It was actually requested quite a bit. Like, geez, why can't I just launch a browser from inside the IDE instead of copying and pasting? Well, now you can. The one I like the most, and the one that was the one feature we got the most out of the integration with Spring, was we had to fix our Maven support. So I hate to keep asking, but how many people actually use Maven? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so there's a lot of people that use Maven out there, and it's tough because Maven doesn't always work well with IDEs, and actually it doesn't really work well with Google Web Toolkit or Google App Engine SDKs. Simply because there's a structure to our SDKs when you actually unzip it, and I urge you if you haven't downloaded the SDKs, go do it, but when you unzip them, you'll notice that there's a structure to them. And Maven has its own structure, and when those 2 structures don't align, well, things kind of go awry. So what we did, we said, okay, well, we own the tools, we can fix this. And so with some help from some Spring guys, we moved some special code that they had in STS and SpringSource tool suite into the Google plugin for Eclipse. So now you can actually have Maven projects import seamlessly into Eclipse or SpringSource tool suite, depending on which IDE you're using. Speed Tracer 1.0, I talked briefly about this, but you can do round-trip speed tracing, so client to backend, see holistically a view of your application. Another minor update with the UI, you can launch it from the Google plugin for Eclipse. So there's a notion of just integrating products, not just us integrating with SpeedTrace or us integrating with Spring and VMware, but us integrating our own products as well, just to give you a seamless experience. But let's get to the goods. So the GWT SDK got some major updates and a major overhaul. And what we did was we said, this is the framework that I'm talking about: activities and places, request factory, editors, and cell-based widgets. These are the four main topics the four main features we added to the GWT SDK. What are these? Glad you asked. So activities and places was our formal name for this MVC/MVP framework. Activities equal presenters, and to keep the analogy going, if you're from the MVC world, activities kind of equal the controllers of your application. That's truly where the business logic of your application goes, right? And then the places equal views, so that's your widget code. That's what's displaying the tables and the buttons and the layout. And overall, it's a mechanism from getting from one view to another, right? So when you talk about hyper-optimizing an application, there's this notion of reusable code and when you have to initialize things and when you don't. When you have a large application, if you go through and you initialize all your views at once, you can imagine that kind of makes for a sluggish startup time. So when you use this framework, then we'll actually lazily initialize those for you, things like your places and your views and all your widgets, and then your application is snappy. So the request factory, I mean, from the get-go with Google Web Toolkit, one of the things we prided ourselves on was, well, one, how much AJAX we're using, right? So under the covers, there's a lot of calls going back and forth, even though you stay on the same screen. This is updating up here, this is updating this table, your left-hand nav might update and you don't know it, so it's all happening under the hood. So given the fact that we're doing so many AJAX calls, we realized that we wanted to be super optimized with these. And we wanted to make it easy for you to call them. So what we've done is with Request Factory, it allows you to work with lightweight proxy objects. Another term for these are DTOs, data transfer objects. So you want to think model, domain objects, and DTOs. And going back to the previous analogy, the model, that's just the model. So no matter if you're using MVP or MVC, your model is your model. It's your data. It's how you describe the things that are being passed back and forth in your application. Your domain objects are your entities. That would be like the employee or the expense or the report that I was talking about this morning. And then DTOs are just proxy objects, the lightweight ones. The idea there is this, the takeaway. Imagine if you had a list of contacts, and I was, in your contact, I was actually, let's say, 70 fields deep, right? If you remember, you guys have used Microsoft Outlook, right? That thing is wildly extensible, and there's all these fields, and if I want to make a fetch, especially over my phone, I don't want all 70 fields. I just want the top 10 that I can display, right? So we have to have a way to optimize that so you get only what you can display. And we did that here. And finally, while we were in the process of building this framework for you to create your application, and we realized that, like, well, what good is a framework when you can't view and edit the data? So we said, you know what, we'll build out some editors. And what we do is we give you the ability to take an entity. So again, let's go back and say your employee, and with just annotations, you can annotate it, and we'll create a view for you. So then you just plug that into your application. Given that we give you some baseline UI, they can be customized, and they can be wired up to proxy objects in Request Factory. So there's a notion that I've told you that this is how you show this entity, this employee object, but I can also say to my editor, this is how you're going to get change sets. So if you're viewing Chris Ramsdale, the employee, and some other portion of the application makes a change, gets synced up to the server sends back down a change update, like that my social security number or let's say my mobile phone number has changed. That editor that's displaying my employee record, will be updated automatically for you. And then we have built-in validation too. So if you say a phone number is a phone number and a phone number has to be numbers, you can build that into the framework itself. You can build that into the editor so that we can check to see if you put any alphanumeric characters or alphabetic characters, or that your phone number is of some certain size. The cell-based widgets are a nice one. So these were, if there's one thing we've learned over the years, is that GWT widgets can be kind of heavyweight, and the reason that they're heavyweight is because they're doing all of the syncing for events. So I drop a table on there, and then I put some buttons in the cell, and then I put some another table inside of another cell. Just all of a sudden you end up with about 255 widgets on your page, and they're all listening for events. And when an event comes in, we have to go traverse the tree to find out who to send it to, and it gets slow and sluggish. And we found this out with AdWords really quickly. So we said, you know what? The way to solve this is we'll just have a container, and inside a container we'll have a whole bunch of divs, and when you want to actually generate some UI, We'll generate it with HTML, and we'll just stick it inside that div. So it's very, very lightweight. So what you end up with is a huge table on your screen, right, displaying all kinds of data, but really it's only one widget. It's the container that's listening for events. And the container's smart enough to know that when it gets the event, it looks for some special properties, and it can traverse its tree on its own, a very small tree that is, and find the div, give it to the div, and then he can take care of it from there. So again, minimize event handling overhead, captured by the parent container, relying on safe HTML. That was another one too, is that given the fact that we're injecting HTML into these divs, it's got to be safe. So we've introduced a new component within GWT 2.1 that allows you to have safe HTML. And if you don't know what that is, that's basically so that you can't inject JavaScript into your page. So we'll check it for you beforehand before you actually put it into your table. And then just because of all this, because we've kept it lightweight, because we kept it hyper optimized for the desktop, we get optimization for the mobile right off the bat. So now that I've given you the overview of the framework, I thought we'd take a few slides just to bring it all together, right? To bring, okay, you've told me about all these things. How do I actually do something with them now, right? Now, I'll tell you the best way to do it is to actually go and download the SDK, go and download the tools. We have documentation online, and go and run through some of the samples. But what I'll try to do is, in a matter of the remaining 10 minutes here, to step you through what's going on, and then feel free, we'll probably leave 5 minutes to do some Q&A. So putting the pieces together, I'm going to go through 3 steps. We have app startup. Kind of have to have that, right? We got to go request some data, because what good is your application if you don't have some valuable data inside of it? And then if you get the data, we have to display it, right? Pretty trivial. This has to happen. So let's see how we put these pieces together. So for app startup, the first thing you're going to start off with is an activity manager. This is going to be the person that gets you around in your application, all right? So he has an activity mapper. So if I have an activity manager, right, that's the core of getting around my application, my activity mapper gets me from a place back to an activity. Now, what's a place? A place is simply a spot in your application, right? Hence the name place. I want to go here. Okay, well, give me the activity that gets me to this view. I want to go view the details of an employee. Great. That's a new place. Tell me the activity that gets me there. So you have an activity mapper. Now, typically, and like remember the application I showed today where we had a simple left-hand nav and then we had a table that was actually showing some values? That left-hand nav is getting me to different spots in my application. So how do I show it? I actually get a display panel. A display panel is just the widgets that show that navigation. And you set that via set display on the activity manager. Okay, so now I need a place controller, right? I need somebody that's actually going to take care of when I invoke the I want to go here, he has to get that. And the place controller is the guy that's going to coordinate notifying everybody else that the user wants to go to another place. Mind you, the activity manager can get me there, the place controller is going to notify the rest of the application. Then you have a place history handler. So remember how I mentioned that you get history support right out of the box? Well, that's because we have a place history handler. And what that does is that's going to take a bookmark or a URL that has a hashtag, or basically a place in your application, and it's going to turn it into a place request. And the way it does that is the place history handler says, okay, I know how to generate a place based on a URL that you've given me or a bookmark, but I don't know what to do with it. So what do? I need to know about the place controller so I can tell the place controller, hey, he just hit a bookmark, and I need to go to this place. So they register via that mechanism. Now, we've got all this happening up top. How do we get them to notify each other, right? So from GWT 2.0 and on, we have this thing called the event bus, which allows you to pass requests and events back and forth. So we have an event bus. And then they all hook into it, and it's hunky-dory, right? So everybody's tied together, but how do we actually get events? What are the events that pass back and forth? Okay, so we remove everything else, and we just simply say, okay, these two are the important parts. The place controller and the activity manager. Again, I want to go somewhere, I tell the place controller. The activity manager says, I can get you there. So how do they do that? It's actually quite simple. When I want to go somewhere, I simply, my application, calls go to on the place controller and hands it a place. Go to this record. Show me the details. Place controller says, that's great. Takes that place, wraps it up into event, fires a place change request for you. Now granted, this is all part of the framework happening under the covers. Puts it on the event bus, and then the activity manager picks it up. Says, great, I know how to handle a place change request. So it takes that place change request event, gets the place out of it, calls the activity mapper, says, hey, you know how to map places to activities. Tell me what activity goes with this. Activity mapper says, hey, this is great. This is the record detail activity that you need. says, great, gets back an activity. Now this is the guy that's actually going to take this and put up a view on your screen. And what happens is the activity manager says, thanks for the activity mapper. I'm going to call start on this guy. I'm going to pass him a panel. And a panel is nothing more than a container where you can start drawing. And the event bus, because you're going to have to get some events back and forth. So at that point in time, that's when you start getting your view up. The activity says start gets called on it, and it says, I know how to draw inside of a panel. So now that you have that initial view up, how do you go and request data, right? So right now, all I have is an empty screen. So this is where code generation really takes on. This is some of the power of Google Web Toolkit. So I start with an employee list activity, right? And what this is this is an activity, as I mentioned before, but it's specific to listing. And it's specific to listing certain types of objects, in this case, my employee, right? Now the framework is going to call into that and say, I need a range of objects. I need the first 10 employees. Get those for me. Because the rest of the application doesn't know how to do it. They're like, I don't know, I just know that I need 10 employees. Employee list activity, find them for me. Again, the activities are the brains of your application. It's where all the core code goes. So the list activity says, you know what? I know about this thing called a request factory, right? And I know that request factories will get requests from me to my back end to actually get data to me. So he has a request factory. In fact, he's initialized with the request factory. And he says, okay, give me the employee request, because I need to get the first 10 employees. Request factory says, cool, no problem. I know how to give you back an employee request. And I also know what concrete class this is linked to on the server side. Because at the end of the day, I can talk about code generation, all this magic that happens, but you got to do a SQL call to get data out of your database, right, to get it back to your application. So right now, this is all on the client side. So the list activity says request factory, give me an employee request. He gets one, goes through some generated code to call find all. It's kind of tough to read there. It's list employee proxy find all. Give me all the employees. And calls some generated code that's generated by the GWT compiler and code generators. That's the magic. And finally gets to your employee class on the server side. So this blue box on the right-hand side for you is actually server-side code that's going to run. And you can tell because it's got a select star from SQL call, right? And that gets back a list of employees. Then what it's going to do is it's going to pass it back through the generated code. The generated code is going to take care of serializing all of those employees, right? Some big array of employee records down to some JSON format and pass it back to you. And then what you get, voila, is a list of employee proxies. Now you're like, hold on, wait a second. So I actually asked for employees. Why am I getting back employee proxies? That goes back to the employee proxy is the lightweight version of your employee. You can define which fields you want. But the point here, the real takeaway is that you asked for a list of employees and didn't have to worry about what the JSON payload looked like, all this serialization code. You just got back a list of employee proxies. And you can start iterating over them and doing whatever you want to do. You have your data now. And it feels like an object. So now this gets really easy. So now I want to display this, right? So I could iterate through these, and I could, pick apart fields and everything. But we have this nice piece of the framework where once you have this list, all you have to do is you have a list view. Now in this case, list view is an abstract class. So you derive from it, and I have my employee list view. That's specific to my application. But you get a bunch of helper methods along with that. So my employee list activity now has a list of employee proxies, a list of employee DTOs. Says, cool, I'm going to give it to the list view to show it because I'm an activity. I don't know about widgets. I don't know how the screen's constructed. I don't even know if I'm talking to a mobile view or a desktop view. But I know that I'm going to give it to this view, and they'll take care of it. The employee list view says this is great. Now, if you follow MVC enough, you know there's one key rule, that your views really don't know about your data model. Your views don't know about your business logic. They're really dumb views, right? All they know how to do is to take some data, put it on the screen, and be done with it. So how do you do that? How do you give the employee list view a set of objects that it doesn't know anything about? How does it know how to parse those to get the fields out so that column 1 is my first name, column 2 is my last name, and then column 3 is my mobile number? That's easy. What you do is you have an outside entity that actually knows about your data model, knows about some of your business logic. And it says, look, Mr. Employee List View, I know that you don't know much about the world, but I'm going to tell you how to separate this record that comes back and what column to put the data in based on the fields. And all it does is it calls add column and gives it, okay, for the first column, it's going to be the name. You're going to have an abstract cell. That's going to be the cell you actually draw into. And I'm going to pass you a get value method, right? This is an anonymous inner class that knows how to get the data out of the employee proxy so that the view never knows. It simply iterates over its columns and says, okay, column 0, here's an employee proxy, you tell me what the value is. And that code that knows how to dissect that lives back inside of the activity realm, so it knows about data models and things like that. So it's a way of getting your entity broken up on the screen without violating some of the principles of MVC and MVP. And then finally, when it's all said and done, you have a screen that looks like this. And this was a real app that we demoed at Google I/O, where you have taken apart a expense report. Yeah, it sounds like we're big on expense reports, I get it. But we take apart an expense report, and you have the purpose, the notes, the department, and the created. And what I just showed you is exactly how that view is brought up right now. So that's really about the first 10% of it. And then there's a whole bunch more afterwards. So again, I encourage you to go download the SDK, check out the documentation, and then we have a wildly active developer forum. So I think we're up to roughly 23,000 users at this point in time. So there's a lot of you out there. We're out there. Go check it out. Thanks.